Hello, folks. Welcome in. Welcome, welcome. We'll wait just a few more moments for some folks to trickle in. Let them have some time to click the link, sit down, settle in, and then we'll kick things off. All righty. Okay. Just a few more moments. Okay, so we will kick things into gear. Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name's Danielle. I am the Public Programs and Visitor Services Manager at the Morris-Jumel Mansion. And I'm so happy that you all can join us on this evening for another edition of Connect260, which is our special virtual parlor chat series that goes in conjunction with our special exhibition, What the House Saw, 260 Years of Stories from the Morris-Jumel Collection and Community. And this session is really exciting for me because it's going to talk about one of my favorite people in the entire world. But also a very, very interesting topic. It's based upon the theme of our antebellum section of the exhibition called A Woman's House in a Man's World. So before I get into our special guest for the evening and introducing her, I'm just going to give a little bit of background about the mansion for anybody who hasn't been before or is new to our online programming series. So the Morris-Jumel Mansion is celebrating 260 years this year. It was built in 1765, and it's the oldest remaining house in Manhattan. It was listed in the National Register of Historic Places in 1966, and then designated as an individual landmark in 1967, and then an interior landmark in 1975 by the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission. It's built on the ancestral land of the Lenape people and was likely built and funded using enslaved labor. It was used as Washington's headquarters in the fall of 1776, and it housed Eliza Jumel, spoiler alert, my favorite person, former Vice President Aaron Burr, and Anne Northup, who was the wife of Solomon Northup, who wrote 12 Years a Slave about his time when he was kidnapped and enslaved down south. And so many more of these sort of hits of history and wonderful, amazing people, movers and shakers who have been through the halls throughout the years. And then another fun fact is that it inspired Lin-Manuel Miranda, who wrote parts of the hit musical Hamilton at the mansion. And now just some quick updates before I introduce Margaret. July 18th, so this Friday, is our Tavern Night fundraiser. The weather is looking absolutely gorgeous, and I think my manifestation skills have really paid off there. So come on out, grab your tickets before they all go. They're almost sold out. We are going to have a wonderful night in the park. The weather's going to be perfect, and it'll be a lot of fun. And then on July 24th, we have Movie in the Park, which is Puss in Boots: The Last Wish. And that'll start around 8 p.m. or just when it's about dark enough to see the film projected. Then on August 8th, we are so happy to partner with Emiliano Messias, who is a Latin Grammy winner, and there will be a night of Argentine tango at the mansion with lessons to begin, and then a wonderful tango and dancing concert at the end. Then on August 9th, it is Family and Community Day. And then August 14th, we have another movie in the park to take advantage of the warm weather, which will be McFarland USA, which is a phenomenal movie, if I add. And then we're back here on August 20th for another Connect 260, which is focusing on the section that is centered on the age of urbanization and the theme, the city grows, the house expands in our special exhibition. And then drumroll please, on August 23rd and 24th, we will be having our 33rd annual Jazz at the Mansion with Marjorie Elliott and Parlor Entertainment. And so that, of course, will promise to be such a wonderful time. And then save the date for our annual George Washington dinner. It is going to be, as many things are, in celebration of 260 years of the Morris-Jumel Mansion. It will be in September this year, on September 18th, and it will be at the Shabazz Center just down the road from the mansion. So mark that on the calendars. And now a quick logistical aspect of our Connect 260 virtual parlor chats. One of the most wonderful things that we're able to do here is have questions submitted throughout the program. So please use the Q&A feature on your Zoom webinar and use that function to submit questions. And then at the end, I'll be the voice of the audience and I will ask Margaret all of your wonderful questions and we'll dive even deeper into what we discussed today. So now, without further ado, to talk about women like Eliza Jumel, how they had the odds stacked against them in a world shaped for men, talking about Eliza and some of the women just like her, black and white contemporaries of her time, is Margaret Oppenheimer. So Margaret Oppenheimer is the author of The Remarkable Rise of Eliza Jumel, A Story of Marriage and Money in the Early Republic. A writer and editor, she holds a PhD in art history from the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University. Besides her biography of Jumel, Oppenheimer has written numerous articles on the fine and decorative arts of the late 18th and early 19th century and authored an exhibition catalog, The French Portrait, Revolution to Restoration. And so now, without further ado, I am going to stop sharing my screen and pass the torch over to Margaret. So Margaret, take it away.
Thank you, Danielle. Can you see my slides? Great. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to be here tonight on the 160th anniversary of Eliza Jumel's death. We're going back to her beginnings. Eliza Jumel was born Betsy Bowen in Providence, Rhode Island on April 2nd, 1775, just before the outbreak of the Revolutionary War. There was nothing in her beginnings to suggest that her name would be known 250 years later. She grew up in the most impoverished circumstances. As a young child, she lived with her mother in a brothel. Twice, she and her sister were sent to live in Providence's workhouse at times when their mother was unable to care for them. Then, when Betsy, the future Eliza Jumel, was only 10 years old, the overseers of the poor directed that she be bound out. That is to say, she would have to live and work in a stranger's home as an indentured servant. I'm going to talk today about how Eliza managed to do what she did, begin the poorest of the poor in dire poverty, and end one of the wealthiest women in New York. I'll be talking about some of the factors from the first 3 decades of her life, that is, from her childhood to her marriage, that contributed to her success. I'll also describe the stories that some of her I will also describe the biographies of some of her contemporaries to flesh out some of the unrecorded aspects of her youth and illustrate what other paths she could have taken. The first factor that shaped Eliza Jumel and made her future success possible was an accident of birth. Her father, John Bowen, was a resident of Providence, Rhode Island. So Jumel inherited that status. In modern terms, she had birthright citizenship, although it was citizenship of a municipality rather than of a country. This was exceptionally important for a poor girl. Like cities today, local authorities in colonial America did not want to have to support migrants. The only people with a right to public assistance from a city or town were those who had legal residence by birth, marriage to a local, purchase of real estate, or completion of a local apprenticeship. If a non-resident seemed likely to need support, they were warned out, that is, driven out of town or escorted to their town of origin, whose officers would be obliged to take on their care. The town officers would even pay people to self-deport, to use a modern term. So if you look at the papers of the commissioners of the almshouse in New York City in the 1790s, they paid for paupers to travel to other states where they had friends and family, or even return to other countries. They paid for one woman to go back to Jamaica. They also gave small sums of money to chronic offenders who kept returning to New York City and being a charge on the public purse. So, for instance, the commissioners agreed to give Edmund Robinson 8 shillings to go to Bound Brook, where his children lived. And they wrote quite indiscreetly in their ledger that they hoped to get rid of him, at least for a bit. So the practice of warning out resulted in a permanent underclass of transient migrants, many being women and children, trying to find a place that had job opportunities and avoid getting kicked out, but having almost no chance to get ahead. According to Ruth Wallace Herndon, 682 people were warned out of Providence, Rhode Island between 1750 and 1800. 5 times the number warned out of any other Rhode Island town. The fact that Eliza and her sister and brother had residency in Providence gave them at least a modicum of stability during their early years. Also, I mentioned that Eliza and her sister lived on a couple of occasions in the workhouse in Providence. It was not a great place to live, but without residency, they wouldn't have had the right to the food and the shelter it offered. The next factor that shaped Eliza Jumel and made her future success possible, that factor really, the credit for that factor goes to her mother, Phoebe. Barbra Streisand describes this factor in a song in the movie Yentl. The words go like this: "There are certain things that once you have, no man can take away. No wave can wash away, no wind can blow away, no tide can turn away, no fire can burn away, no time can wear away." What she was talking about was education, learning. Eliza's mother, Phoebe Bowen, was impoverished and illiterate, but she made sure that her children learned to read. By the time Eliza was 10 years old, she and her sister Mary owned a spelling book. To help you understand the importance of that to Eliza's education, I need to explain just what a spelling book was in the 18th century. It was also called a speller, and it served as what we might call a primer today, the first text you would use when you were learning to read. It might take you several years to go through your speller. You began by learning to read the alphabet, just as children do today. Then you would study syllables, very short syllables, 2-letter syllables, and 3-letter syllables. You can see here, table 1 is 2-letter syllables beginning with consonants. Table 2, 2-letter syllables beginning with vowels. And table 3, 3-letter syllables. At this point, you could move on to very short words. And finally, you would be able to read simple sentences. The last section of the speller included fables that taught moral lessons that gave children a chance to read more extended passages of text. From the diaries of teachers who taught children with spellers, we can get an idea of the ages at which children mastered the various tasks. So somewhere between the ages of 4 and 6, you would learn the alphabet, just as children do today. Then you would start practicing syllables. An 8-year-old would begin to read material in the spelling book. And as you can see in this slide, most of the sentences were religious. And by 11, a child would be reading the more complicated passages in the speller and would begin to learn to write. We can make an educated guess that Eliza was probably at the stage of reading in her speller, but not yet writing, when she was 10 years old and her family was recorded to have owned that book. This was also the age at which Eliza was bound out, meaning that she became an indentured servant doing housework in a stranger's household. She probably received some additional education there. Contracts, when children were indentured, specified that they should receive some education. Girls were typically supposed to at least be taught to read. Some girls would be taught to read and write, and boys would receive education in reading, writing, and ciphering, that is, mathematics. Not all employers honored the promises in the indentures, but Eliza's probably did, as she was an avid reader as an adult and wrote plenty of letters, although she admitted that she did not enjoy writing. She also became adept at math, so either her mistress taught her ciphering or she found a way to teach herself. That sort of education, a self-education, was not at all unusual in early America. Take the case of Deborah Sampson, whose name is remembered today because she put on men's dress and fought in the Revolutionary War. Sampson, just like Eliza, was bound out as an indentured servant at around the age of 10. At that point, she already knew how to read, but she was given almost no additional schooling, so she had to educate herself. According to her biographer, her method was to listen to everyone that she heard read and speak with propriety, and when she could, without instruction, catch the formation of a letter from a penman, she gladly embraced it. She used to obtain what school books and copies she could from the children of the family as models for her imitation. And as soon as she could write, she began to keep a journal. Again, her biographer says she recorded her good deeds on the first, third, fifth, etc. pages, and her bad deeds on the opposite pages. If anyone listening this evening has read Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, you'll recognize that he systematized his self-improvement in something of the same way. He made charts of 13 virtues, such as frugality, industry, cleanliness, and humility, and each day he marked down whether he had committed a fault relating to that virtue. So a letter written in 1837 by a former U.S. Senator, William Ellis, shows just how effective the sort of self-education Deborah Sampson gave herself could be. He wrote, "From my own acquaintance with Deborah Gannett," he's using her married name, "I can truly say that she was a woman of uncommon native intellect and force of character. Her countenance and voice were feminine, but she conversed with such ease on the subject of theology, on political subjects, and military tactics that her manner would seem to be masculine. I recollected, it once occurred to my mind, that her manner of conversation on any subject embraced that kind of demonstrative, illustrative style which we admire in the able diplomatist." We can imagine Eliza Jumel as a young servant searching out scraps of education in much the same way that Deborah Sampson did. She was later a member of the New York Society Library and checked out a wide range of books in both English and French. So she had clearly developed an extensive vocabulary and valued learning. Here is, well, this is what she might have looked like some years later, perhaps around 1810 or 1812, after her marriage, when she had the leisure to read as much as she wanted. From that same time, this is from 1813, we have the circulation register from the New York Society Library, which shows some of the books that she checked out. So if you look at the very top on the left-hand side, you can see a French book titled Secrets des Arts, Secrets of the Arts. That was a self-help book. It gave instructions for everything from winemaking to dealing with insect infestations. Then 2 lines down, we can see that she checked out a popular Gothic novel, Elf von Dolmen. And approximately 2/3 of the way down is Paul et Virginie by Bernardin de Saint-Pierre. That was one of the great best-selling novels of the 18th century. More about halfway down, there is an English translation of the letters of Pliny the Younger. So she was reading the classics. On the 4th line, there was a set of plays by Molière, and she checked out several more volumes of that. And a volume of plays by Racine appears about halfway down. So 4th from the bottom, you see Drelincourt on Death, somewhat morbid subject, but apparently it intrigued her because she checked that out twice. Now, Eliza's reading matter as a comfortably married young matron gets us ahead of ourselves. We need to go back and pick up at the point when she turned 18 years old and reached the end of her years as an indentured servant. She would have to decide how she was going to use her education and training to support herself. The choices she made would influence her future. Professional options for women at that time were very limited. Probably the best case scenario was running a small business, such as a milliner's shop, a general store, a tavern, or a boarding house. I've put some examples here. A Mrs. Rice, who had a boarding house opposite the State House in Providence in 1796. Over to the right, there's an ad for Mrs. Camp, who had an apothecary shop in Catskill, New York, at the same time period. And then down below, there's a reference to Mrs. Coates' Tavern in Charleston, South Carolina, which was hosting a meeting of the Society of the Charleston Ancient Artillery, probably a group of war veterans. The problem was for Eliza that starting a small business required capital. Most women who owned businesses took them over after their husband's death or had some savings or an inheritance that allowed them to get started. So running a business was not a likely occupational choice for a girl who grew up in poverty and had just completed her indenture. Almost all girls who were bound out were indentured to domestic service or housewifery. So after they completed their indentures, they would typically work for wages as servants. If they didn't have a full-time job in someone's home, they had to piece together an income through sewing, weaving, laundering clothes, or the like. In comparison, a boy coming out of an indenture would usually have been taught a trade that would allow him to support himself. Might be barrel making, tailoring, seafaring, shoemaking, or farm labor. Now, these were the most poorly paid trades for men. Boys whose parents had the resources arranged apprenticeships for them in in-demand fields such as carpentry, blacksmithing, bricklaying, or other skilled crafts. But at least a boy who had been indentured would have the resources to support himself. We can get an idea of why it was so much more difficult for poor girls than poor boys to overcome poverty by looking at comparative salaries for men's work and women's work. There's some useful data in an act published by the New Hampshire General Assembly in 1777. It was designed to regulate prices, maximum prices for labor and foodstuffs. This act was passed because it was a wartime economy, 1777, and prices were skyrocketing. So the act states that carpenters could not charge more than 4 shillings per day. Masons could not charge more than 4 shillings 6 pence per day. And tailors could charge a maximum of 3 shillings per day. In comparison, what is referred to as women's common work could pay a maximum of 2 shillings 6 pence per week. Notice I said per week, not per day. So what a woman could earn per week was less than what a male artisan would earn per day. Sorry, just adjusting my camera here, which keeps shifting around. All right. As another data point, to add to that, at those wages, it would take a woman 3.5 weeks to pay for a pair of woman's shoes. So almost a month of her income. As another data point, Sharon Bradslaw Sundu reports on a brother and sister in New England in 1769 who were the children of a farmer. The girl, Lydia, earned 8 pence per day washing. That was probably washing clothes. Her brother, Nathaniel, who was just 13, was earning nearly double that for farm labor, 1 shilling 2 pence per day. Very few women could get ahead with the wages they could earn. An exceedingly rare exception was Eleanor Eldridge. She was born around 1784 in Warwick, Rhode Island, so about 9 years after Eliza Jumel. She started working as a servant at the age of 10, the same age as Eliza Jumel and Deborah Sampson did. She remained in this position for almost 6 years. Her biographer wrote that during that time, she learned all the varieties of housework and every kind of spinning. And in the last year, she learned plain, double, and ornamental weaving, in which she was considered particularly expert. This training in weaving that she received was especially extensive, better than what the typical indentured girl would receive. At 16, she went to another household where she did the family's spinning for a year. And after that, she worked as a dairy woman for 8 years. Again, quoting her biographer, she took charge of the milk from 25 to 30 cows and made from 4,000 to 5,000 weight of cheese annually. She did not marry or have children. Instead, she kept saving money until she was able to buy land and build and rent out a house. Then she saved up enough to buy a second house, earning extra money by weaving, spinning, nursing, and soap boiling with her sister. By 1827, when she was in her early 40s, she owned a small house in Warwick and a large house in Providence. In this slide, you see her holding a brush that was probably used for whitewashing, which was one of the jobs that she took on to make a little extra money. So yes, it was possible to gain a modicum of financial security through women's work, but it took constant labor and you weren't likely to get rich at it. Race also played a role. A poor Black woman like Eldridge would have an even more difficult time getting ahead than a poor white woman like Jumel, as a subsequent event from Eleanor Eldridge's life story illustrates. So during a time when she was working out of town, some men colluded to seize one of her houses, and she had to go to law to get it back. She ended up having to raise extra money to buy back the property. Her biographer, Frances Harriet Whipple Green, wrote, "No man ever would have been treated so, and if a white woman had been the subject of such wrongs, the whole town would have been indignant, and the actors would have been held up to the contempt they deserve." Eliza Jumel would certainly have seen how poor her prospects were if she remained a servant. Even if she could be as successful as Eleanor Eldridge, she would still have to work hard for the rest of her life. Another more appealing option for women who had received some education, as Eliza had, was writing. Getting paid for it was the challenge. For example, we can consider Phyllis Wheatley, who was born in Africa around 1753, so roughly a generation before Eliza Jumel. She was brought to Boston and enslaved at the age of 7 or 8. She was exceptionally quick to learn English, and she was writing poetry before she entered her teens. She wrote the very first book of poems published by an African American woman. It was published in London in 1773. The image you see here was the frontispiece of the book. The main benefit to Wheatley from her literary career was that she was given her freedom, although she remained with the Wheatleys as their servant until they died. Writing, unfortunately, did not lead to future. All right, folks, here we go again. So we're talking about Sarah Josepha Hale, who was widowed with 5 children in 1822 at the age of 34. She had previously enjoyed writing, but had never done so for pay. So she resorted to that. She began to submit poems and stories for publications to help support herself and her children. However, to make ends meet, she still had to open a millinery shop with her sister, which was work she did not enjoy. She was not able to support herself with the pen alone until she wrote a successful novel, which led to her being asked to become the editor of a new periodical, the American Ladies Magazine. She then had a 50-year career as an editor, ending when she was 89 years old, editing first the American Ladies Magazine from 1828, and then Godey's Ladies Book, which acquired the American Ladies Magazine in 1837. So the career that supported Sarah Hale was editing rather than writing, although she did write many contributions for the periodicals she edited. And though this has generally been forgotten, she was the author of the poem Mary Had a Little Lamb. Sarah Hale was considered the first professional American woman editor, so that was hardly an established career for women in the late 18th and early 19th century when Eliza Jumel would have been looking for employment. Teaching was perhaps a more feasible option. However, most teachers were male in the late 18th century, barring a few women, usually married, who ran academies for genteel young women. Here I've put an ad for an academy, a male academy run by Peter Delamar in a large schoolroom. But if you look at the bottom of the ad, you can see that at their home address on Pine Street, Mrs. Delamar, his wife, kept an academy for young ladies. Now, hopefully, her students were better behaved than these girls who took advantage of the schoolmistress's nap to dance, play with a cat, and push forward the clock to hasten the end of the school day. Most women who aspired to careers as educators were relegated, as in so many professions, to the bottom of the ladder. They had to take ill-paid temporary positions, usually teaching young children. Deborah Sampson, who I mentioned before, moved on to teaching after completing her indenture. She taught what was called a summer school for 2 years in a row. According to her biographer, with whom she shared information from her diary, she taught the children using primers, spelling books, a psalter, and a few Bibles. The biographer adds that a sheet of paper was sometimes allowed to the boys for the exercise of penmanship, while the chief occupation of the girls was to knit and sew. He says that Sampson was more successful in her second year than her first, as, quote, she had the advantage of a good man's school the preceding winter. She still had to work as a servant and a weaver to support herself when school was not in session. Sampson wanted more, just as Eliza Jumel would want more. Sampson's biographer writes, to a considerable extent, she was a daydreamer and a builder of castles in the air. She had a strong desire to see the world, to visit distant regions, to behold society in new lights and under unusual aspects. She determined that she would, in all events, quit the ignoble employments in which she had been accustomed in a farmer's family in Middleborough, of feeding pigs and poultry, applying the spinning wheel and the loom. She resolved, therefore, to put on male attire and travel. In fact, what she did was to go off to war, probably at least in part for financial reasons. In later years, after the war, she married a farmer and lived in very modest circumstances. So the good education that she achieved largely on her own did not end up having much financial payoff. As you can tell from the stories of these women, Eliza Jumel did not have many good choices as a young adult, but she made the best of a bad hand. The first professional choice she made, that is the first we know a bit about, was an unusual choice for a single woman. She took on the care of a child who was, like her, from Providence, Rhode Island. It's likely that she received some money from doing so, and that is how she was able to move to New York City. We normally hear about choices like this from the opposite perspective, that is, of people who had to find relatives or other people willing to raise their children because they could not afford to do so themselves. For example, I spoke of Sarah Josepha Hale, the editor. To take her first editing job, she had to leave 4 of her 5 children to be raised by various relatives when she moved from Newport, New Hampshire to Boston for the position. Another example of this has a Morris-Jumel mansion connection. Those familiar with the mansion may be aware that George and Martha Washington, with the members of George's cabinet and 2 of Martha Washington's young grandchildren, visited the mansion on a party of pleasure in 1790. The children were raised by the Washingtons because their mother, Martha Washington's daughter-in-law, did not have the resources to raise all 4 children after her husband died young. She kept the oldest of her 2 children with her, and the Washingtons raised the youngest 2, and you see the 2 of them here. To return to Eliza Jumel, again, she raised a child for someone else, a man named David Ballou, which likely gave her the funds to get herself to New York. There, she entered on her second documented profession, acting. Plenty of girls dreamed about becoming actresses. As one critic wrote, they hoped for a genteel income and a profusion of public panegyric. But far more of them dreamed about acting than actually attempted life on the stage. The barriers to acting were high. Most women who succeeded in the profession had parents who were actors or were married to actors, or both. For example, Margaret Sully West and her husband, who emigrated from England to America, were both actors. Her husband founded a theater company in Virginia in 1790, and Margaret West took over the management of the company after her husband died in 1790, and their daughter became an actor as well. It was helpful to be part of a family unit if you wanted to act because it gave you a way to fight against the association between acting and prostitution that affected the social status of women who took up the profession. Robin O. Warren, who has written a book about women actors and directors in the American South, goes into this issue. She writes, because all actresses displayed themselves in public and relied on what theater historian Tracy Davis has called skills of deception, they were mistrusted and considered promiscuous. They were, as Warren writes, especially dangerous to the status quo because they could deceive people about their class by imitating gentility. Eliza Jumel was a brave woman to choose to go on the stage as a single woman without family support, and that choice affected her reputation in ways she was never able to overcome. For example, she was never accepted in New York high society, even after she became wealthy. But acting was a good match for her aspirations among the choices she had. Although she never had much success on the stage, she was never more than an extra. It was probably at the theater where she met her future husband, Stephen Jumel. I volunteered as a docent at the Morris-Jumel mansion for about 7 years, and some people were disappointed when they asked me how Eliza Jumel made her fortune, and I had to say that she started by making a good marriage. But that should not be held against her. In her era, to reach the financial position she attained, she really had no other option than marrying money. I think the stories of the women I have told about in this presentation make that clear. A scholar who did extensive research on the year 1774 reached the conclusion that 97% of all wealth in New England in that year was held by men. Another key part of Eliza Jumel's story is that she was making her fortune at a particular moment in time. The main way at that time to make significant amounts of money was through the ownership of real estate. This was very different from a century later when the US had an active stock market, which made possible the success of women like the stock trader Hetty Green. In the late 18th and early 19th century, unless you started in the middle or upper class, there was no path to acquiring significant amounts of real estate and therefore great wealth without marriage. Even if you look at women who became well off or wealthy a generation or two later, you will find that marriage was crucial to their success. As an example, we can look at another woman who had a brief acting career, Miriam Follin, who became better known as Mrs. Frank Leslie, her name by her second marriage. She was born about 1836 in the South. She was illegitimate and almost certainly biracial, but she passed as white and was able to keep the secret of her racial identity until her death. She also benefited from a more middle-class upbringing than Eliza Jumel, although her family's financial situation was often bad. Through a strange set of circumstances, she was trained for the stage by Lola Montez, a famous actor, dancer, and courtesan. She did act on the stage for about a year, and she seems to have been quite talented, but she abandoned that career to marry a not very appealing man who had money. The reason was that marriage offered greater security. She later developed a highly successful career in her own right as a writer and editor. After the death of her second husband, Frank Leslie, she took over his chain of 12 newspapers and magazines and made them highly profitable. But it was marriage that allowed her to reach those heights. Eliza Jumel, like Mrs. Frank Leslie, didn't become rich just because she married a wealthy man. She came up with the strategies that led to her success. First, she got herself to New York. Second, she went on the stage, which probably allowed her to meet Stephen, her first husband. She chose a good man who was kind and knew how to manage money. And in that, she contrasts with Miriam Follen, the future Mrs. Frank Leslie. Miriam became very wealthy on multiple occasions by marriage, but then she would find herself struggling again because she married spendthrifts who would lose all their money. So Eliza Jumel made a good marriage, and then she took advantage of the marriage to turn herself into a businesswoman. She became so adept at buying and managing property that she was able to grow the money in real estate that she acquired through her husband into a much bigger nest egg. In doing so, she repeatedly used men's expectations and assumptions about women to achieve her own ends. However, my focus today was on her first 3 decades. For the next stages of her life, I must refer you to the pages of my book, which you can find in the bookshop at the Morris-Jumel Mansion. Over to you, Danielle.
Alrighty, wonderful. Thank you, Margaret. That is so great, and that was a great way to plug that book, which I totally recommend everybody check out. It is one of the best documentary histories that I've ever read. Really contributed to my love of Eliza Jumel, even though I loved her from the start. It's only helped me grow fonder. But now we will move into the Q&A portion of the VPC. And I highly encourage folks to go ahead and put any questions that they have about Eliza and women of her time, and how they changed their circumstances, for Margaret. But to start out, I have one right here, which is, what do you think Eliza and women like herself who were able to change their circumstances had in common, if you were to make sort of an educated guess about the traits that were sort of a common thread throughout them?
I'd say there were a few common threads. First of all, they tended to obscure bits of their background. Um, Eliza's early years in the workhouse did not come out until a fight over her will after her death. Um, the same way that Mrs. Frank Leslie's biracial background, again, came out in a fight over her will. They also were willing to step away from what women were expected to do. Um, it meant taking on greater risk and not being as well accepted most of the time, but the greater the risk, the greater the reward. Um, I'd say the third factor would be they were very intelligent and determined women, because it took a lot of determination to get where they did. Okay.
Alrighty, that was awesome. So this question is about your book. How did you begin writing the book, aside from being a volunteer at the mansion? What sparked that inspiration, and how did you get there?
I had volunteered to work at the Morris-Jumel mansion because my background is French painting, sculpture, and decorative arts of the late 18th and early 19th century. At that point, much of the decoration at the mansion was French Empire, so it seemed a good fit. Once I got on the volunteer roles and started learning about Eliza, I realized that some of the stories that were told about her didn't fit with each other. And this struck me because I knew about late 18th, early 19th century French history. For example, the story was that Eliza and her husband offered one of his ships to help Napoleon escape to America after the Napoleonic Wars and the fall of the First Empire, and that they were, close friends of Napoleon. But then there was also a story that they moved at the court of Louis XVIII, the restored Bourbon monarch. Well, those two pieces of information were really not compatible. And I kept running into these strange incongruities, and that's what got me started researching Eliza's history. I had an advantage that much of the material I used for the research was located in New York. The massive fight over her will after her death, the papers were at the New York division of the National Archives and also at um, the court archives in the Surrogates Court building in New York City. And I was really lucky to get to consult them because, I don't know, maybe 7 years or so ago, all of those archives were moved to Albany. So,
That's wonderful. And so we have another question, which says, "Thank you, Margaret, for an informative talk. From what you know of George and Martha Washington, is it fair to say that he married a woman wealthier than he was?"
yes, I think that would be correct. She was a slaveholder. And one thing I didn't mention in the presentation was around 1775 in the North, the wealthiest people owned most of their wealth to land. In the South, the wealthiest people owned most of their wealth through their ownership of enslaved labor. When you looked at um, the probate files after their death, each piece of property would be estimated, the value would be estimated. And sadly, the price of enslaved labor was estimated. So Martha Washington, as a slave owner, would have been a very wealthy woman.
Thank you, Margaret. So we have another question. This jumps a little bit forward in the timeline. But Madame Jumel divorced Aaron Burr. How common or easy was divorce at that time, and on what grounds were divorces permitted?
Okay, let me make sure I heard that. How common was divorce at that time, and what grounds was
Yeah.
it permitted on? Yes.
How
Okay.
common or easy? So I guess
Oh,
common and slash or easy.
okay. All right. It was not easy, and it was not common, and it was expensive because you had to go to Chancery Court. New York had a Chancery Court, just like England did, um, up until 1846. If any of the people listening have read Bleak House by Charles Dickens, you know that whatever you do, you should never go to Chancery. In Bleak House, there was, well, there was a case that went on for so many years that all of an inheritance was eaten up in costs. And New York Chancery Court was a little quicker, but it took money to do it, to get there. Um, it was also very hard to get a divorce because there were only a few ways you could get one. Um, the first was adultery by one or the other of the partners. Uh, Second, a marriage that was never valid to start with because the one of the parties was already married, so bigamy, or I'm not sure what you call it if the one of the spouses has three or four or five other uh, spouses. At any rate, that would invalidate the marriage. Um, let's see, if one of the parties was incapable of consummating the marriage, Aaron Burr tried to use that argument at one point. Um, let's see. Um, I'm missing one. Oh, if someone was persuaded fraudulently into a marriage, that was also a grounds for divorce. I think that's about it. New York was one of the more restrictive states in some of what were then considered the Western states, which we would now call the Midwest. You could get a divorce on grounds of desertion or severe cruelty. In New York, you couldn't get a divorce for cruelty, although you could get a separation for that reason, but you wouldn't be able to remarry. Uh, I guess I should add that divorce is very much a state matter. Um, how you got it and how easy it was to get depended on where you lived. So New York was very unusual in having chancery court. Um, in many other states, you had to get a private act of the state legislature, just as you would have to get a private act of parliament to get a divorce in England. So,
Wonderful. So I see we're over time and I don't want to keep you here any longer. I want to be respectful of your time. I'll give just a moment more for anybody else who wants to pop a Q&A question into the Q&A feature. But this has just been so wonderful, Margaret, and so informative. And I'm so happy that we were able to do this. And I want to thank everybody else for coming as well. So we'll just give it one more moment. Get those last buzzer beater questions in. Um, then while we're waiting, I guess I'll ask, what's a favorite trait of Eliza's of yours that you think really contributed to her success in paving her own path and not letting fate take her hand and decide what her life would be for her?
favorite trait. Well, she sometimes reminds me of Becky Sharp in Vanity Fair. The first time I read Vanity Fair, I didn't like Betty Sharp. I mean, she took advantage of a lot of people but then when I was older and I reread it, I thought, you know, she was out for herself in a time when no one else was going to be there for her. And I like that bit about Eliza Jumel that she was willing to do what she had to do to get ahead. And I think she was very clever that whenever she went traveling, she would reinvent herself and move herself up the social status. So that gave her some pleasure, and I was glad to see she got that.
She definitely had a sense of humor too. So she had all the wonderful traits that got her to where she was and a sense of humor, which is always appreciated in my book.
Yes.
Um, but all right, I see that we have tapped out with the questions. So we we'll let you head on to the rest of your evening, Margaret. And thank you so much on behalf of me and the Morris-Jumel Mansion. And thank you to everybody who was here tonight and joined us for our Connect 260 session. We are going to be back again, like I mentioned, August 20th. So be sure to tune in. And I will see you all next time. Thanks, folks.
All righty. Thanks
Bye
so
bye.
much, Danielle, and thank
Thank
you
you,
for
Margaret.
Mansion.